everybody was able to get in here, and we are live on YouTube. Well, I welcome everybody to the last day of our ComSciCon Houston / Texas 2021. We're excited for our third panel, which is hopefully not only the most rich in experience and questions that you get answered, but also our largest panel. So today we have 4 panelists, and I'm really excited for our panel. And I'm gonna jump right into it, and would like to open up with a small, brief introduction of all the speakers. So if you can maybe just introduce yourself very quick for the audience. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about your job, and where you are right now. So I think, Vivienne, if you could start.
Sure. So I'm a freelance science journalist and writer currently based in San Antonio in Texas. I was trained as a biologist, and after my postdoc became a science writer, worked at the NIH for a few years, and then moved to Texas for family reasons and have been freelancing since 2017. Yeah.
Awesome. Lynn, if you could go next.
Good morning. It's so neat to see everybody's faces. It's like seeing my old friends after this week. It's an intense time, isn't it? So I'm Lynn Cedric, and I'm a professor at Baylor College of Medicine, where I've been for 23 years. And I'm very passionate about communicating what we do with NIH or NSF dollars, because those are the taxpayers. And I feel like it's our responsibility to let people know what science is really about, and also to show what science can look like, because people are often surprised. Vivian, you may get this too, that I'm a scientist. I'll be somewhere and they're like, you? Or they'll come to me and say, there are scientists in this room. And I'm like, really? Because I'm also one, right? So somehow people just don't understand that women, people of color, we can be scientists too. So I'm very excited to be here today. And I just can't believe I'm on this panel with these wonderful people. So thank you, Eric.
Kaya, can you tell us something about yourself and where you're at?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Keo Collier. I'm based in Austin. I'm an investigative reporter for 2 publications, both ProPublica and the Texas Tribune. They're both, nonprofit, all digital publications. ProPublica is based in New York, primarily an investigative outlet, and the Texas Tribune focuses on Texas politics and policy. And I was at the Tribune for about 5 years, reporting on the environment and energy, among other things, before becoming a full-time investigative reporter for this new team. So I got to know a lot of scientists, got to spend time with them, talk to them about their research, and hoping I can shed some light on what made those conversations productive.
Yeah. And Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe Palka. I am currently a science correspondent for NPR. I've been in the same dead-end job for 29 years. I got hired as a science correspondent. I'm still a science correspondent. Before that, I worked for Science magazine, and before that, Nature in the news section. So that was when I would call it my serious science writing career began. That was January of 1986. Prior to that, I guess I'm working my way backwards. Prior to that, I was trying to break into journalism, and I happened to start out in television. So I had a bunch of different jobs, sort of bouncing around, freelance, and then working also for a local television station in Washington. And I made the totally unusual transition of local television news to Nature, which is bizarre. And I don't think anybody else has ever done that. And before I got into journalism, I was working on a PhD, which I guess I ultimately received in psychology, I was doing human sleep physiology. So I was studying people actually in different ambient temperatures. And I would say that in the 30 plus years I've been a science journalist, no one has ever asked me to do a story about human sleep at altered ambient temperatures. So my PhD has not been directly relevant to my science writing career, but in many ways it's been completely relevant. And one of the things I've been doing in the last 6 years is running this, or helping to run this thing called the NPR SciCommers, which is a group of scientists like Lynn who feel a commitment to science communication and want to connect with people who are similarly inclined. And so if anybody wants to join us, you're welcome. Just send me an email, jpalka@npr.org, and I'll forward you on to the right place.
Great. Okay, thank you for introducing yourself. So let's dive right into today's topic. So today's topic is navigating public opinion, or in other words, policy. So maybe as a general question that everybody could give like their definition on, how do you define public opinion? And have you ever experienced that your work actively shaped public opinion? And how did you accomplish that? I think that's a threefold question. And we can go in the same order, maybe.
Okay, I'm going to need a minute to think about it. So I'm going to pass to Lynn.
Okay.
Maybe Lynn can kick us off.
Will you tell me the first question again?
Yeah, so first of all, like, how do you define public opinion?
I've never been asked that question. So like Vivian, I'm like, okay, because what I feel is public opinion is a little squishy in that it swings this way and it swings that way. And I have a hard time pinning that down, but I also kind of keep myself, I guess I listen very carefully to public opinion, but I kind of am who I am and I do what I do, and it's almost independent of public opinion. The second one was,
how have you experienced that your work actively shaped this public opinion?
well, I mean, of course, for me, I'm not at NPR and I'm not at ProPublica and I'm not a freelance writer. So I'm just within my small little network. I try to just talk to people where they are. And I've been very proud when, for example, one really extreme person on one really extreme part of a particular argument, let's just say vaccination, gets vaccinated. And I rejoice when this happens, and it has happened a few times, and I do take credit because I'm the person they come to, they trust, and they can ask, how dangerous is it? Should I be scared? And I can try my best to explain. And if it's just one person at a time, because that's all I have, and sometimes I'll post on my YouTube, I'm sorry, not my YouTube, my Twitter account, whatever those best facts are to help people make their decision, but I'm not going to be the person who screams or yells or becomes politicized or even follow public opinion.
I think as journalists, we often think about public opinion through the lens of polling. So the Texas Tribune, for example, does, and lots of publications do regular polling of, it's usually narrow to like specific issues, but the Tribune's been polling on things like climate change, and that's really the main science related topic, but it's like, politics, who do you prefer, in the upcoming election. But public opinion has shifted on climate change in Texas, at least. I know it has nationally too, but it has in Texas. And, despite like Joe and I having national platforms, I mean, there's really no one story, or your story has to just be very significant and very, I don't know, lots of special things for it to single-handedly shift public opinion. Like, I think, it would be nice if it did do that more. I mean, what it often does in my case is it forces a company or governmental agency to change their policy, to propose a law, to do that kind of thing. And that obviously is somewhat related to public opinion, and that they realize that their constituents are mad, or that kind of thing. But it is very hard to put your finger on public opinion and public sentiment. I mean, I would say that especially in the realm of the science kind of environment realm. But yeah, polling is really kind of really the only objective way, I guess, to know exactly what people are thinking and what is on people's minds. Of course, there's lots of limits to polling, but it's, as far as I know, kind of the only way to really know for sure what people are really thinking, other than talking to a ton of people all the time, which I also try to do.
Yeah, I think he has hit the key points. It always really bothers me, and we do this in journalism all the time, where a host will say to a reporter in Minneapolis, "What's the mood in the city like today?" And I'm going, well, Bob wanted to get pizza, and Susan was thinking about going bowling later, and a couple people were going to go to a protest. I mean, what's the mood of a city? Who knows? Even with polling, okay, so 67% of the people in Texas think that environment is a big issue and it's a problem. Okay, that still leaves a couple million people who don't. So I don't really. I mean, I think a little bit like Lynn. I don't really consider public opinion, except that it's of interest to me, but it doesn't influence what I report on generally. And then I guess the question is, well, why are we interested in public opinion? And I think the answer is, again, what Kia said, that legislators or policy makers will, put their finger in the air and try to understand where people are coming from on various issues, and legislate or policy make in response to that. And the question about whether I've had an impact, I mean, again, I'm assured that I have, because people say that influencers listen. Well, it used to be influencers, but certainly people in Congress listen to NPR, or their staffs do, and so presumably they're hearing me say something that they think, oh, it's important, Joe Palca said it. And so they make some decision, but they don't usually call me up and say, that's why we did it. So I really, it's always struck me as funny, there is a way to study the impact that I have, but NPR isn't in the business of studying the impact that I have. That's an academic question. They're in the business of getting people to listen to NPR. And so, yeah, to the extent that public opinion, I mean, I'm sure some people hate NPR, but listen to it anyway because they like to get their blood pressure up. It's hard to know how to characterize it, but I think Lynn and Kia captured the main issues.
Did you want to add something to that, Vivian?
Sure. I would say that maybe the place where I've had the most maybe interaction or potential to influence public opinion was the last couple of years. I've been the lead writer for the National Cancer Institute's annual plan and budget request to Congress. So this is a document that kind of outlines a very high level view of, here are recent areas of cancer research where we've made a lot of progress, immunotherapy or the use of AI in cancer research and things like that. So kind of highlighting what are the really hot topics or areas that are seeing a lot of progress right now. And also outlining, here's what the National Cancer Institute hopes to accomplish in the coming years, assuming that Congress will give them a good budget for the next fiscal year. And so that has been kind of intellectually interesting for me, because I get to learn what are the hot areas of cancer research and where is the progress being made. and trying to communicate that to, thinking about, okay, who's going to read this? It's going to be like a staffer on Capitol Hill who doesn't have a lot of time and who just needs like, what are the big highlights, so that has been a really fun project for me the last couple of years. I guess another area that where my work has sort of touched on this, because actually, so like a lot of my stories might be kind of straight science, so they're not really impacting public opinion, or there's nothing really controversial. It's just, here's this interesting new scientific discovery, and I think that is in itself worth reporting on. But sometimes, like last fall, there was a paper that came out in Nature Communications that argued that they basically did this kind of a big data analysis of mentor-mentee relationships and found that students who are mentored by female PIs, I think they get fewer citations in the next 5 or 10 years. And so they basically argued that students should not seek out female mentors. And of course, that caused this big outrage on Twitter. So I think, I don't know, sometimes the way I, check public opinion is just, what are people talking about on Twitter? And in this case, my Twitter feed was completely full of people who were completely outraged by this paper. And so I ended up writing a story for The Scientist about the paper and the subsequent reaction of the scientific community. And so that it's not so much influencing public opinion as just reporting on it. And I think that is also worth writing about and reporting on.
Thank you. So a lot of our attendees, or I would say all of our attendees, are at the moment graduate students, PhD students, which have a kind of unique position. So maybe out of your experience, what is the most effective way to impact public opinion? And I'm going to mash that up a little bit with Holly's question, who asked, how do you advocate for empirical evidence-based facts when the public doesn't have access to many peer-reviewed journals?
I think nobody wants to go first. Maybe you should call on one of us. But
Yes, sure. Lynn, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I mean, this is exactly what science communication is, isn't it? Right? Taking and most people can't actually digest publications anyway. Like I think that one of the skills that a PhD will give you, even if you never refer to those works ever again in your whole life, is the ability to critically evaluate literature. And so I think that that's sort of all of our jobs, right? To try to digest the primary literature or a new paper or whatever it is and communicate that honestly. And I think that when people sensationalize or really go down one side of, say, a scientific argument, it puts people off, and the people we put off might be the people that we can learn from the most and who might need to try to get out of their own confirmation bias to see the new way to think about a problem, right? So I think one thing that I try really hard to do is to recognize that usually these answers are not yes, no in science. It's sort of probabilistic or statistical, right? Okay, the risk benefits ratio are this. So I think that the more we can do, and nobody likes smushy science, right? Everyone wants a very clear answer. But I think that when we're honest, we don't lose the other half, because I think in our nation right now, about half people feel one way about almost every single topic. Sometimes Joe talked about 67%. Sometimes there's a majority, but that's a whole lot of people feeling differently. And so I try really hard not only to talk to the people who think just like me, and I try to listen to the people who don't think just like me, so that I can also understand whatever the arguments might be. So I guess my view is, again, a little bit almost philosophical on this, if you will. But I think I pay a lot of money to put all of my papers online, like they're available to the public. I'm not sure how many people in the public have actually ever read them, but I do pay that money so that if somebody wants to look at something that might be controversial that I've published, they can get there. But we can't ask that of everybody, and it's a very expensive thing to do. I've had to pay out of my own personal pocket, for example, to do that a few times. So that's my thought. I don't want to. I'm just jumping in because silences are kind of hard, but you can. I think feel free to call on us if you want.
I'm curious, Kaya and Joe. So maybe Kaya first. You're coming from a different area. So how do you deal with the fact that many things are published and the public doesn't really access that?
I mean, as reporters, investigative reporters, I mean, we have tools and paid subscriptions to find those peer-reviewed papers often. I usually end up finding out about them kind of through interviews too, and then contacting the scientist or researcher directly and saying, I'm really interested in your research, and like, can you send me a free copy of your report, because there are some you can't access, like even with paid subscriptions or Google Scholar or Nexus or whatever. So I mean, I would say what I have done often is so there's a tool that we use often that was founded it's for journalists. It's called Document Cloud. And it also helps you kind of organize the different documents and reports you're going to write about or focus feature in your stories. And you can upload PDFs, mostly PDFs, to Document Cloud and link to them. And on several occasions, I've asked the researchers for permission to upload those, journals and link to them, and kind of high level speaking. I mean, as journalists, it's our job to find those ones that are worth writing about and reaching out to researchers and scientists who, the authors, who produce them, and to try to understand them better, to read them and to convey them to the public. I will say that it's often, it's hard to get people to talk about their research sometimes sometimes it's hard to get them to talk about it, period. But it's more often they want to talk about it, but they have a hard time explaining their work. And it's taken me quite a bit of practice and many to get to a place where I feel like I can successfully interview a scientist who's not used to talking, to a lay person about their research, and getting to a place where I can understand it. And sometimes, when you encounter researchers who are like, I don't want to, talk about it or whatever, it's, I've kind of gotten to the place where I'm like, do you not want anyone to know about your research? Like, are you just in this dark room, like, doing this stuff? Like, why are you doing this if you don't want people to know about your research? And that usually gets people to talk. And I do understand the daunting task of trying to explain really complicated subjects to the public. It's a really hard thing. It's really, really hard. But you just have to find analogies, and analogies are a really great way to kind of to explain really complex subjects. Chronology. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways you can make things more explicable, I guess, and comprehensible. I don't know if that answered the whole question. But.
Yeah, I would be curious. So, Joe, you've interviewed probably so many different kinds of scientists. what would you say for a scientist? What can we do as scientists to make our research better and more applicable? Or even is it that scientists should reach out actively to reporters? What's your advice you would give somebody who's in the science field to really have an impact on the public?
Well, I guess I would start with saying show up. I mean, I guess it's a version of what Kia was saying. If you want to have an impact, don't hide when the reporter calls. And just so by the way, if you're calling, just as a practical matter, most reporters are calling you with a deadline, and if you call them back the following week and say, "Oh, sorry, it took me a while to get back to you," they might not even remember why they called in the first place. So it's a different time scale, and you have to be aware of that. This question, I mean, I think I've become convinced that disseminating information via me or the media is sort of old school. And I mean, it's made a great career for me, but I don't think that the sort of the bottleneck that I represent is going to be, it's not as relevant anymore. I mean, and I say this, you know, when I started in journalism, you either had a printing press or a broadcast tower at your disposal, because those were the only ways to get dissemination. And now, you know, anybody who's watching this has the same global tool of communication that I have. The question is, how do you build an audience? And I unfortunately am no expert in that, because I was handed an audience and told, now don't screw it up, because we like to keep this audience. So, you know, be sure to do interesting stories from here on out. So I don't think my experience up till now is really relevant to what's going to happen going forward in terms of public communication. What I did believe, and the reason I started the SciCommers, and again, I'm not too proud to say I'm always interested in people joining us, and I put my email onto my picture here so you can see it if you want. But I just believe that, you know, if I have 1 million listeners, that's great. But if 1,000 scientists have 1,000 followers each, that's the same 1 million people. And I think that kind of impact is important. And finally, I mean, I couldn't resist when Lynn was talking about, you know, making papers available. I think that's not, I mean, my impression is that most of the public doesn't go to the basic literature. And so we're always reliant on people to act as interpreters for us. And I was just looking at her paper that's entitled Top A, the Sulfolobus sulfataricus topoisomerase 3 is a decatenase. And I'm thinking, well, if I decided that was a paper I needed to read, I was in big trouble, even though it's available.
That's not my paper. I'm a co-author on that paper. It's too bad you picked that one.
I picked that one. I picked that one for that reason, because, you know, there are things that are accessible, and there are things that are totally obscure. And having access to a paper like this isn't going to help me very much. That's not to say this isn't an important topic and that people might want to know about it, but I'm less worried for the most part. I mean, yes, I and Kia and Vivian want to be able to access original material so that we can try to digest it, get experts to help explain it to us, and then explain it to others. That's what our job is as interlocutors, for example, that's a way. But I'm not so worried about the public doing that. At least I don't think that that's really, I know it's important that people be able to access information, but I don't think it is always all that valuable.
I totally agree with that. It's your job to interpret that and find the ones that are worth interpreting and writing about. And it's, you know, hopefully all of you will, contact reporters or develop followings on social media, which is a important kind of component of the whole public opinion, communicating with the public aspect of this. And yeah, it's hard to interpret those papers often. I don't think the public would read them themselves, you know.
I would just add too that I think one of the kind of ways that journalists can add value is often providing context around a paper. So a lot of what I do when I'm reporting on a new paper is not only going to the scientist who wrote the paper, but also talking to their colleagues or other people in that field and getting their perspective on where does this fit into like the history of this area and how is this an advance, you know, and kind of providing that context for people around the study is super valuable and important. And kind of connected to that, I don't know if maybe this would be my advice to graduate students, but and this is just anecdotally, my impression has been that when I interview graduate students, they're usually really good at telling me like, here's exactly what I did, here was the experiment, you know, but often I have to go to the PI to get the bigger picture of where does this fit into everything else? And so my advice to graduate students and postdocs is the better you can get at putting your work into that larger context, the more effective a communicator you will be. And I think that is something that, you know, people slowly get as they get farther in their scientific training. So I have just noticed this difference between when I'm interviewing students and postdocs versus PIs. And yeah, so really, getting that bigger picture is really important and useful. And also sometimes, you know, sometimes some of the stories I've done have been combining, like maybe there have been several papers out all around very close to one another and they're all related to the same topic. And so my job is to kind of tie them all together and say like, how do these things fit together and fit into the bigger context? And again, I think that is more valuable for somebody, you know, who's just reading the story and they can be like, oh, so this is how this all fits together, right? So, you know, if a reporter comes to you and you can help them connect the dots between different papers, that is also super helpful and useful.
I think Joe and Vivian hit on something very important. So navigating public opinion is the topic. So my question is, which approaches when navigating public opinion would you discourage to use? I think, like I said, Joe and Vivian already told a little bit about that. Maybe Lynn can like tell us a little bit more what to discourage. What should we watch out that we don't do whenever we're like talking to somebody who's not a scientist?
I think we have to be very careful with people. I think we can't talk like, you know, we have to keep our cool and not get impatient with what they may not know, because our job is to try to make it clearer. And if I come in and start having a conversation with somebody and I say tape, cephalobus, whatever that title was, it's just, who cares, right? And it's gonna go right over their head. So I practice something crazy in that when I'm on a phone, you know, on a plane with somebody or on a bus with somebody and they ask me, what do you do? Because I'm always editing a paper or working or doing something, right? What do you do? I will tell them, right? I'll give them my elevator speech. And Eric, you know, at Baylor College of Medicine, I think every department works really hard now on these elevator speeches. And so anybody on this that is not from Baylor College of Medicine, go home and start with your 1.5 minute, what do I do speech so that you can communicate clearly and practice it over and over and get feedback. And that was what my session was about, right? About how to get the feedback from people. So my rules are I don't shout at people, I don't call them names, and I listen first to understand what they know. I tailor what I do to the audience I'm talking to. I think it's a big mistake to talk like you're going to talk to a bunch of experts like yourself and talk in that language, which is sometimes what papers are, aren't they, Joe? I mean, they're just for each other, and that's kind of opaque. And so, except for that paper where I'm not the contributing or the first author or really was in charge of, we work really hard to try to use language that's a little more friendly and try really hard to engage people. And I think just treat them with respect and don't yell, because if you alienate half the country, which is what we've been doing, you're going to lose those people as an audience. And maybe that's a tragedy, in my opinion.
Yeah, maybe Joe can add to that, I think.
First of all, I apologize for teasing Lynn about that. I looked at the other papers and I chose this one. So I was just having a little fun.
It's hilarious. I'm laughing so hard.
Yeah, I think big picture is very important. A lot of times when I do stories, I guess this isn't relevant to most of the people here, but there was a story I wanted to do about adaptive optics, and somebody I was talking to was giving me, this really important new tweak in the algorithms for adaptive optics. And in case anybody doesn't know adaptive optics, or the technique of unblurring the blurring that is caused by the medium through which light is traveling. So if it's a star, it's the atmosphere, but they actually use it in the eyeball to unblur the light going through the medium in the eye. And this person was telling me all this latest information. I was saying, look, I know everybody in the field knows adaptive optics, but I'm not reporting to you. And most of the people I know don't know adaptive optics. So I think it's just appropriate to tell you about adaptive optics, and it's like the problem Kia has, do you want to tell people that methane is a greenhouse gas? Well, maybe now we're getting to the point where people do know that, but at some point earlier on, you had to keep reminding them, well, it's not just carbon dioxide. And that's not new to a scientist. I mean, scientists have known that for quite some time, but it's whatever you imagine that the public does or doesn't know that you're trying to communicate. And so you have to try to put yourself in the position of, what does this person reason to be? What can I expect this person to know? I mean, I'm the wizened older person, but we used to debate about whether to say what DNA was, the blueprint for life. I mean, I don't think people do that anymore. DNA is probably common parlance now, but there's new stuff coming along all the time, and so you have to try to gauge what your audience knows. But it's true. I mean, when Lynn sits down in front of a classroom, it's a different connection. Even classroom, colleagues, that's totally different than communicating with the public. That's a thing that's called education or research, and it's not the same as what we're talking about here.
Maybe adding the question from Ashley Tucker, who asked if you have any tips on navigating highly politicized topics. So she says she works with embryonic stem cells, and she's always nervous about who is in the audience and will hear her talks. So I don't know, Kaya, I bet you covered also some of these topics. Do you have any tips or advice?
Yeah, it's really tricky. Being an environment reporter for a long time in the state, and I was an environment reporter through the lens of state politics and policy. I was covering the legislature, that kind of thing, and all of Texas's leaders are Republicans who are climate deniers, and who, and it was tricky to, I did this big project about, hurricanes and, the perfect storm that will kind of destroy Houston, really generalize. And, we would show these models to elected officials, and they would just be like, no. And I don't know what to say about that. And you're like, well, do you believe that the climate's changing? And I used to ask people, do you believe the climate's changing? And I kind of got to a place where I stopped asking them that, because it was so just like, you should believe this, and it's insane that you don't. And so let's just talk about, what are you going to do about climate change? And when you ask them that, then it's like, well, I don't think, it makes it a little harder for them to give a just really politicized kind of answer. But I don't know. I mean, kind of some of the advice Lynn gave applies here, where you have to be patient and not yell, and be really transparent about your process. And like why it's, in the case of stem cells, it's like, I mean, address it head on maybe, and just say like, I know that this is a touchy topic for some people, and here's why, some people think that, and here's why I don't think that that's the case. But transparency and patience, I think, go a really long way describing your process. As a reporter, I really try to be, patient and remain open, and kind of take the tone of like, I'm just curious, and I'm just here to try to figure this out, and I'm genuinely interested, and just tell me about, about what you're doing. And when you approach things calmly and respectfully, and even when you're saying, well, 99% of scientists disagree with you, if you say it in a nice way, and just keep the heat low. I mean, I think it's going to be tricky always, and it's a case by case sort of thing. But just try to be patient and not lose your cool, and explain things, and be transparent. Yeah.
I would even want to add Natasha's question in it, which goes a little bit in the equal direction. So how do we better communicate scientific findings that are still changing or developing? For example, efficacy of masks for the pandemic early on, or topics like that. If Viviane maybe wants to have a first shot at this question.
Sure. I think that, what Kia said about being transparent, I think it applies, and it's super important to not talk down to people and not act like you know everything. So if you are just transparent about, here is what's known, here is what is not known, and here's what we're doing to figure out what is not known. I mean, kind of like what's happening with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine right now. I think, I think the regulators did the right thing, which was to say, we noticed a problem, we're pausing the vaccine, we're not going to give the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we're investigating the problem, we will report back to you as soon as we know more about what's going on. And I think they're not, alternatively, they could have said, oh, well, let's just keep going and not make this a big deal. But that could have, in the end, damaged public trust, And so I think thinking long-term about how do you build and keep public trust, even if in the short term, maybe your goal is going to be set back a little bit. I think that's a really smart decision, basically. And so I would say, not talking down to people, like assume that the person you're talking to is smart, and that if they disagree, maybe they have a good reason, or, so yeah, I guess that would be my.
But I would just add, the hard thing is, you can say exactly what the case is, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine issues are a perfect example. You can say it. I will play back the transcript of any of the reports I've done and say, yeah, I captured that uncertainty. But you go out and ask people, and you'll find that a lot of people say, oh, I heard on NPR that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine causes blood clots. I never said that, but that doesn't mean that that's not what people are going to hear. So I mean, I don't have a solution to that problem. I think a little bit as scientists or science reporters or people like that, we're sort of stuck with the truth, and we can't say no, it doesn't cause blood clots, because that would be wrong too. But it's a bind, and we can't be fully responsible for what people hear. We can only be responsible for what we say, but understanding context, I think that's the problem. I think Vivian's right. Do you lose credibility? Well, you lose credibility among people who care about credibility. What's been bothering me in the last few years is there's plenty of people said, doesn't matter to me. I don't believe it. It's just, who cares? I mean, anyway, politically, I don't understand, how people can say that the facts don't seem to matter, but to some people they don't.
I think, Jasmine, you actually had a really good question that goes with this. So recently, many people consider themselves experts on topics because they understand simplified explanations of research. That info could be interpreted incorrectly, and then they reiterate false info. So how do you approach communicating science in a digestible way for people, but also not simplifying it to the point where it loses meaning and doesn't require to use critical thinking? Maybe Lynn, maybe you can jump in. I know you're kind of in the field of trying to simplify things, and I had to chime in there on Joe Palca because I also co-authored a paper with Lynn, and I know for a fact that Lynn tries her best to get the title and everything to a point where it's not only understandable, but also in a kind of way humorous. And so I'm curious if that's one thing that you use, Lynn, or what you would suggest using.
That's a really hard thing to do. I have seen a few people, and I know that on Twitter, at least, if you speak and your background is not on something, you will be jumped on immediately. And it reminds me of kids, right? It's really, I'm not somebody to jump on people when they speak from a place of authority that they may not hold. And I try not to speak on things I don't know. That's why I researched so hard how to get feedback, because it wasn't a topic that I knew, and it's certainly not something I do well. So I learned so much in preparing it. So I don't know, but I think that you need to start with, I'm not an expert on this topic, but here's how I digest it. But in a way that's not fair, because every single journalist is not necessarily an expert. In fact, in Joe's case, I guess it's 100% of the time, it's not on something that you're quote unquote the PhD level expert on, right? So we can't make the bar so high that you have to be this expert. You just have to be able to quantify or evaluate data in a truthful way. That's a tall bar to ask of people. So I think we all could just pull back a little bit, and something that is interesting about this question is that there is bias. So people of color and women, our expertise is questioned even when we are experts. So there is sort of an added layer of, you are not an expert. So what happens is people who are accused of this can become even more withdrawn, which removes diverse voices, right? So there's this negative feedback that can happen. So I think that if there's a factual error, I think we can point that out. And otherwise, unless they're saying something completely wrong, let people speak, because sometimes there's a nugget of of really creative ideas or diverse viewpoints that I wouldn't want to stifle.
Yeah, it's a funny question because I mean, Joe and I, and probably me to, more of an extent, like we are the idiots who don't know, like we don't know, and have to learn maybe, like I have the luxury of time being an investigative reporter. So I do feel like I am able to get to a place where I understand the science or topic really well. But most journalists can't do that. They don't have the time to do that. And you kind of have to boil down the most important points, especially for someone like Joe. I was going to say I have such respect for broadcast journalists who have to tell really complicated stories often in like 2 minutes, and like no wonder people hear the wrong thing. They're like getting in their car and whatever, and all they remember is Johnson & Johnson and blood clots. And for me, it's like my medium is writing extremely long stories that you worry about people even reading, but it's like you are able to get into more of the details and the research and quote more people and just really just present more information, period. So I don't know, I think it goes circling back to the whole like patience and transparency thing, I think is good. And just hitting like, it's like, what do you want people to conclude from this? Like what are what's the main conclusion? What are those top 3 conclusions? And why should people care? Which also goes back to the context thing that Vivian mentioned, like people should care because, this is, no one's ever concluded this and, whatever. And we have to think about that a lot as journalists and deciding what stories to pursue. Because it's like, does this matter to people? Is it really going to impact their lives? Is this like, what is the harm? Like as an investigative reporter, constantly thinking about, the harm, who's being harmed, the level of harm, and then thinking about potentially like what impact a story could have, because that's really what we strive for is having impact. And such as lawmakers passing a bill that protects people better, whatever, XYZ.
Talking about media, so Kshipra had a question. So as you all pointed out, media is the mediator between science and public. But since media is not a homogeneous group, so meaning supporting one political party versus the other, so are there any tips or ways scientists can approach the media to make sure the right information is dispatched despite the media heterogeneity? Someone wants to jump in?
I'll let you take that, Joe.
Well, one thing that I would suggest is that if you're talking to a reporter, I know it feels like a one-way street, but it's really not. You can, in fact, ask the reporter if you're getting the feeling that they're not getting what you're talking about by the questions that they're asking you. You might just inquire, well, what's your take on what I've been saying, or did you understand X, Y, or Z? And see if you can put the train back on the tracks, as it were. But I often say that I'll defend every journalist when scientists will defend every scientist. That usually stops them from being too critical, because there are some terrible journalists out there, but there are also some terrible scientists. And so I guess that, you're really limited in the number of options. If somebody's determined to tell a story one way and you think it's all wrong, you can just stick to your talking points and what you think is true and cross your fingers.
You can also look at their publication. I mean, I think that and see and read stories by them before and do research about what publication it is. I mean, I do take the whole issue of publications being liberal or conservative or whatever is, so I worked for newspapers for a long time, and newspapers typically still have editorial boards who endorse candidates, in elections. And that's they're on a completely separate floor of the building than the news side of things. And yet when, I would go out and be reporting, people would get mad at me for the endorsements that the newspaper's editorial board made. And it's like, I haven't even met those people. Okay, so that's just a practice that I like. So the Tribune doesn't have an editorial board, which I like. I'm so thankful for, because I think that's rooted a lot in people's misconceptions about publications being liberal or conservative or whatever. And I do think there's truth to that, obviously, but it's just way more nuanced. But knowing getting to know the reporter, to read what they've written. Typically reporters are very easy to find. You can find, search the website of their publication and see what they've written or aired, and then you can decide whether you want to talk to them, or not. And you can usually, just by perusing a website of a publication, you can get a pretty good idea of what they cover, how they cover it. And I know a lot of PR communicators keep an ongoing spreadsheet of publications, especially if they're dealing with more niche or smaller publications that you might not have heard of. They keep a spreadsheet and keep track of those publications, those reporters, and just notes, for this is what I observed when I read what was on the homepage, and that kind of thing. And it does depend on the reporter too. It really can. Like a lot of these, newspapers are, they're laying off a lot of the older reporters and hiring really young, inexperienced journalists to kind of, for really high profile, kind of complicated beats, including, environment or science related topics. And that's not to say that the journalist is not capable of doing that, but it's, you just have to get to know the reporter and figure out if it's someone you want to talk to. I always tell people I pay more attention to bylines, which reporter is telling the story, than the publication often. And that's because that's a very insidery thing, but getting to know the reporters that you trust and respect and is really helpful, I think.
So as the last question, Desiree actually had a very interesting question. So how do we promote confidence in the public when we never talk about or publish results that are negative or don't work? Who trusts someone who's always right? Lynn is smirking, so she probably has an idea.
Well, when I'm reporting science, I try really hard in the paper to talk about the things that didn't work. We tried this, we were wrong, or we tried this and we couldn't make it work. But there are many reasons for things not to work. There are technical reasons that have nothing to do with actual disproving or proving a hypothesis, right? So I think that the best papers will include as much of the negative results as they can. And I think that I find I'm drawn to papers who are very open and clear about the limitations of the work. So I think that at least from my standpoint, I think that it's a disservice to mention what didn't work, because it's ridiculous to think that everything is going to work. And a scientist who goes in to prove something is a bad scientist, right? You go in to test something. So I have to say, as I've reviewed for papers for, I don't know, 27 years or so for journals, right? And I've seen this increased number of papers with these little thin data without controls, missing anything that might have not worked. And I'm worried about that, because it's almost like science is becoming a soundbite, and science is messy, it's complex, it's not just a soundbite. And like I said earlier, it's rarely yes or no. It's degrees of confidence toward yes or degrees of confidence toward no. So dealing with that is a good point. But I think that you can just, if you can, all of you are getting PhDs, or you can evaluate as much as you can. Does that seem sound? Does it look like they did careful science? Did they do proper controls? And if it seems believable, then you state it seems believable based on this, right? And try to come up maybe with some counter arguments if you can to deal with maybe what wasn't done or what wasn't said. I heard that somebody's trying to get this journal of irreproducible results or other kinds of things. I've heard that maybe some of these repositories are starting to accept these kinds of data sets, but the problem is, who wants to go and analyze those data? It's kind of sticky, isn't it? But I don't know. That's my take, is try to be honest with the things that don't work, even in your science. And maybe when you write your papers and your theses, you will do that yourself.
Thank you. Okay, so we hit 10:02. I would love to close out. If you could like summarize or mention in a few sentences, what is something that you would love for the grad students or the attendees of this conference to know? What is something that that you wish somebody would have told you at that stage? Maybe we can start with Vivian.
I think I would just maybe re-emphasize the importance of the context. So make sure that you know the big picture context of the work you're doing, and you're able to communicate that if a reporter is calling you. I think, yeah, that would be my take-home advice.
All right, Kaya.
I guess I have to be self-promoting here, or selfish, and say talk to reporters. Don't be afraid to talk to reporters. And also, it seems like the theme has been, be patient and transparent, and just do your best to try to explain your work, and try to share your work if you can. Be proactive about it too. But if a reporter calls you, consider strongly talking to the reporter. It might be me, so.
Lynn, what would you?
Well, I'm going to go with the theme that I said in the previous session about how to seek, feedback. Just remember that the other side, often they're not evil. They're just people like you, and try to treat them like you would like to be treated, and try to assume that they're just going through a rough time. You never know what people are going through at the moment, right? So there's been a lot of stuff going on. So give them grace, if you will, give them forgiveness, and just keep trying. And graduate students especially, don't give up. If people are harsh on you or have criticized you or disagree with you, don't let that dissuade you from what you want to do. Just learn and forgive yourself if you make mistakes. So I guess I kind of crammed a few of my favorite things in there, but it's okay to be wrong once in a while, and it's okay to own up to being wrong, and just try to realize that we're all on this planet together, and just we try to bridge and not divide.
Joe.
I guess my advice is, if you're thinking about writing for the public or doing something for the public or something public facing, and you want to see if it's working, don't show your colleagues and don't show your PI, and don't, if you can possibly avoid it, show it to anybody who is a scientist. Show it to somebody who's not. Because the corrections and revisions that scientists and your colleagues will make will be based on the wrong criteria, I think. And it's better to, I mean, most of the time you'll know the topic well enough yourself if you're writing about it to get the science bits. The part you need to know is that you need practice communicating to the non-scientist. And so you can get, I mean, I watch people get twisted up when their colleagues are saying, oh, you should say this, you should say that. And yeah, probably, again, if you're doing a seminar or a colloquium, yeah, you should say those things. But if you're just trying to explain to somebody, you know, what the greenhouse effect is, don't show it. Make sure it's somebody who's confused and try to figure out how you can explain it so that person will understand it.
Awesome. Thank you everybody so much for this great panel. We have a few questions left in the Q&A that we didn't get to. If the panelists would have time to stay behind for about 10 minutes to jump into that session and maybe type up some answers, that would be great. We're here jumping right into the prep for the pop talks, where you can actually practice how to communicate to the science, to the public, to people who are not your colleagues. Then that would be great. I'm gonna give it over to Autumn, and I'm gonna post to the panelists the Q&A link so that you can get that. Thank you one more time. Great session, and I hope we stay in contact, hopefully with a good